students, welcome to Legacy IAS Academy. In today's video, we are going to discuss about one of the most important and notable events in the recent world history is that's about Cuban Missile Crisis of year 1962. And in this video, we are going to discuss in detail that what is Cuban Missile Crisis, what are the lessons we can learn from this particular crisis, and what is its relevance in our contemporary world. So without further ado, let us try and understand about this crisis in detail. So the reason why we are discussing this crisis, there are two basic reasons. The first is that this year marks the 60th anniversary or 60th year since this Cuban Missile Crisis has happened. And also earlier this month, the current US President Joe Biden has said that his Russian counterpart, President Vladimir Putin's veiled threat of using tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine marked the first prospect of what he termed as nuclear Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it is in this context also we should understand that what this whole crisis was all about. However, we have to understand that just a day later after President Biden released his statement, his administration and his staff, the White House spokesperson have clearly said that there is no evidence of such claim that Vladimir Putin is going to use tactical nuclear weapons and the world can be basically sent into the grasp of a nuclear Armageddon. However, this year, since it marks the 60th anniversary of Cuban Missile Crisis, let us try to understand at what this crisis was all about and why it is critical to understand that it was the event, or we can say it was the single event in the recent world history where nuclear war seemed very imminent between two superpowers of the world, the Soviet Union at that time and the United States of America. So what was basically Cuban Missile Crisis? So it was spanning the crisis basically spanned between October 16th to October 28th in year 1962. It was overall 13-day crisis that began after the US reconnaissance aircraft have seen that Soviet Union was deploying nuclear capable Soviet ballistic missiles in the nearby island of Cuba. The crisis was marked by several types of secret communication as well as strategic miscommunication. Now, if we try to understand that why US was so much concerned about Soviet missile deployment in Cuba, so we can understand this from this map that we can look at here. So this is the United States of America, and as we can see, Cuba is a small island country situated near the Gulf of Mexico in the North Atlantic Ocean. So the development and deployment of strategic and ballistic missiles of Soviet Union in the Cuba, basically as you can see, we have two types of missiles that were deployed. The first kind of missile is something that is referred as medium range ballistic missile with a range of almost 1000 miles, and the other missile that was deployed was intermediate range ballistic missiles whose range was 2000 miles. So just at a distance of 90 miles from the coast of Florida, Cuba lies, and the presence of such missiles on Cuba, basically as we can see from this diagram here, has brought almost whole United States of America, Canada and part of Mexico under the range of Soviet missile. And there was a high risk that in case of war or in some case of severe confrontation, the Soviet Union can launch missiles in USA, and large number of US cities or major US cities, since most of the US cities as you can see are located on the eastern seaboard of USA, will be under the range of Soviet ballistic missile. So it is due to this reason we can say the missile crisis basically began. So what were the events that have preceded this Cuban Missile Crisis? So to understand that, we have to go back in year 1961. It was in year 1961 when John F. Kennedy was the president of the United States of America, and at that time Cuba was being ruled by Fidel Castro, who was basically a communist dictator and wanted to develop a very strong relations and good relation with the then communist country Soviet Union. However, the John F. Kennedy planned to overthrow or he attempted to overthrow Castro by arming some of the Cuban exiles who were living in the United States of America. Such kind of assault that occurred over Cuba, began from a bay that is called as the Bay of Pigs. However, this frontal assault was a complete failure, and the US attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro regime ended into a failure. Further, in year 1962, again John F. Kennedy and his administration made an effort to overthrow Fidel Castro regime, and to do so, they launched an operation that is well known as Operation Mongoose. Operation Mongoose was a brainchild of Central Intelligence Agency, also called as CIA, and the Department of Defense of United States of America. However, despite launching of Operation Mongoose and despite several successes that this operation enjoyed, finally it also failed to remove Fidel Castro from the power. Now, it is these events when the Fidel Castro is trying to develop a very amiable and good relationship, a strong relationship and partnership with Soviet Union, the failure of Bay of Pigs, the failure of Operation Mongoose, and at the same time, the deployment and presence of American Jupiter ballistic missiles in Turkey have led to Soviet Union premier that time, who was Nikita Khrushchev, who decided to place Soviet nuclear missiles in the Cuba. And it is the placement of these missiles that have triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis. So after these events have unfolded, there are certain events that also has happened in the year 1962. For example, in the month of September 1962, as the Soviets started to build and deploy their missiles in Cuba, President Kennedy publicly warned that Cuba and Soviet Union and Soviet government should siege to stockpile any kind of offensive weapons on the ground of Cuba, which can directly threaten the national security of United States of America. Further, next month in October 1962, despite these warnings, the Soviet Union and Cuba went on to develop the arsenals, missile arsenals, and deployment grounds in Cuba. And thus, U-2 flights that were a kind of reconnaissance flight of USA flying over Cuba, they delivered a message to the White House, and it says that still the Soviet Union is developing the missile arsenals, and the missile is being deployed in that region. So hours after the Cuban Missile Crisis was underway. Further, in the same month, on October 1962, mainly the Cuban Missile Crisis was also unique kind of phenomena, because generally if we talk about in USA, we have the president is there, who is basically functioning from the White House. However, as far as the foreign policy is concerned, there is also a very strong dependency on the US Congress, we can say, especially US Senate and the House of Representatives. Similarly, there is a legislative arm of the Soviet Union also that time, that was called as Supreme Soviet. However, as far as the Cuban Missile Crisis is concerned, none of these bodies, whether it is US Congress from US side or the Supreme Soviet from Soviet side, was involved. Mainly this crisis was between White House and Soviet Kremlin. Or we can also say in one other words that the missile crisis was basically a crisis that were basically, we can say, began between the White House and Kremlin, where John F. Kennedy was at the helm of White House and Nikita Khrushchev was at the helm of Kremlin, the Soviet premier at that time. There was no foreign policy input or little foreign policy input from either the US Congress or Supreme Soviet. Now, as a result of this Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union started to deploy the missile, their ballistic missile, and also started to place their bombers, that is IL-28 in the Cuba, there were two kind of advisors President Kennedy was getting at that time. The one group of advisors, who we can say were hawkish in stance, they said the only way to resolve this crisis is to immediately have a military response, and will include airstrikes to destroy all the missiles in Cuba so that it cannot be launched against the United States of America. Followed by this, we should also go on and have a full-fledged military invasion of Cuba, overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro, and then install another regime that will be favorable to the United States of America. On the other hand, we have a dovish kind of stance, and advisors suggested that rather than going on a full-fledged war or taking any kind of military actions, US should resort to a diplomatic response, and that should include a strongly worded warning to Castro and Khrushchev against any use and deployment of ballistic missile. After heeding the advices of these two group of people, finally President John F. Kennedy took a we can say, middle stance, and he was advised in this situation by his Secretary of State Robert McNamara, and he said that US should try to have a naval blockade of Cuba as a restrained military action. Now, naval blockade is a very important and interesting term, because in the international relations parlance, naval blockade basically means declaration of war against a third state. That means in the blockade, no ships of Soviet Union could have entered into the waters surrounding Cuba, and in other words, Soviet Union could not have transferred any kind of weapon to the Cuba, including missiles and the bombers. However, the use of term blockade was very contentious, because it could have been a direct war between US and Soviet Union. Thus, the clause was watered down, and John F. Kennedy, he basically ordered the United States Navy to establish and enforce a strict naval quarantine of Cuba. So the word blockade was dropped, and word quarantine was used in the official statement and official publications. So after announcing the quarantine of Cuba, President John F. Kennedy sent a letter or telegram to the Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And in this particular telegram, he has clearly mentioned that the further delivery of offensive weapons to Cuba would not be allowed, and that the Soviet missile bases already under construction or completed in Cuba should be totally dismantled and all weapons should be returned to the Soviet Union. This was a telegram that was delivered to the Nikita Khrushchev. As a result of this, Khrushchev responded and he also sent back a telegram saying that if you weigh the present situation with a cool head without giving way to passion, you will understand that the Soviet Union cannot afford not to decline the despotic demands of the United States of America. That means not only Khrushchev decided not to heed to the demands of USA, he also said that we have ordered Soviet ships sailing to Cuba to ignore the US naval blockade or US naval quarantine, as we can see, which the Kremlin considered to be nothing but an act of aggression. However, due to this development between the exchange of letters and telegrams between both these leaders, there was no peaceful end to the crisis in the site, and that is why United States forces were placed at readiness level of DEFCON 2, that is Defense Consciousness 2, that is just one step beyond the declaration of complete war or full war. So it was an indication that war involving the Strategic Air Command was imminent in the near terms. The Strategic Air Command basically is the air command of USA, which deals with the deployment of nuclear ballistic missiles as well as the deployment of nuclear weapons from the bombing aircrafts. As a result of declaration of DEFCON 2, finally almost it is believed that 1,400 long-range nuclear bombers remained in airborne alert, where they could have responded within a time span of 5 to 10 minutes if they have to bomb the Cuban and the Soviet arsenal. And some 145 US intercontinental ballistic missiles were placed on ready status, some aimed at Cuba while some were aiming at the Moscow. So this was the heightened tension. This was a time of heightened tension between Soviet Union and United States of America, which would have triggered nuclear war very easily just if there was a small miscommunication, a small misstep by either of the parties. However, despite all this strenuous environment developing between Soviet Union and USA, first of all, it was Nikita Khrushchev who blinked first, and then he sent a very uncharacteristically long personal and emotional letter to the John F. Kennedy, where he expressed a desire to avoid the horrors of nuclear holocaust. However, after sending this letter, the next in few days, again another statement was given in Khrushchev, where he emphatically demanded that any deal to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba had to include the removal of US Jupiter missiles from the Turkey. That means it was a tit for tat or a quid pro quo kind of arrangement that was demanded by Nikita Khrushchev. That we will obviously remove our missiles from Cuba only if you are willing to remove your Jupiter missiles from the Turkey. Since Turkey is very closely in a very we can say closely situated geographically to the Russia or Soviet Union that time. Obviously, the Soviets felt a threat of missile launch from the Turkey itself. Now, despite this letters, John F. Kennedy did not reply to any of these letters to Nikita Khrushchev, and at the same time, in later US U-2 reconnaissance jet was shot down by a SAM, that is surface-to-air missile that is launched from the Cuba. Initially, John F. Kennedy has said that any kind of such launch or any kind of such attack on the US airplanes will be considered as an act of war and US will respond in kind. However, despite the we can say this shooting down of US jet and the killing of the this jet pilot, the Kennedy did not responded aggressively, and however they began to plan an attack on the Cuba to be carried out as soon as possible if situation does not changes. And President Kennedy at that point in time, we have to understand that the two letters have been sent by Khrushchev to Kennedy. However, Kennedy has not responded to either of the Khrushchev messages. As the crisis become more and more deeper, finally Kennedy took a risk and has decided to basically send another message to the Nikita Khrushchev. And he has said that removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba has to be done and it has to be overseen by the United Nations. And in the guarantee or in the exchange, we will not invade Cuba. So this was the another development that is seen as an effort to basically neutralize the threat or neutralize the crisis or avert the crisis. Following this, at the same time, we also have a lot of intense diplomatic discussion going on between the brother of Robert Kennedy, who was also the Attorney General, and the Soviet ambassador to the United States. And due to the result of this negotiation, result of this discussions and deliberation, finally on October 28, 1962, Nikita Khrushchev publicly stated that all Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from the Cuba. So this basically has led to end of the missile crisis. However, the other part of the crisis still remains because US still continued the naval quarantine of Cuba until November 20, 1962, and it only ended when Soviets finally agreed to remove their IL-28 bombers from the Cuba as well. In the first phase, the missiles were removed. In the second phase, the IL-28 nuclear bombers were also removed. Interestingly, we have to keep in mind that despite the removal of missiles and IL-28 bombers from the Cuba, US had not removed its Jupiter missiles. It was only removed from Turkey in April 1963. That was almost 5 to 6 months after the actual Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what we can understand as the legacy of this crisis. So, as we have discussed, the US attempt to overthrow the Fidel Castro regimes resulted into failure. That is also called as Bay of Pigs failure, and the we can say the diplomatic engagement and the steps taken by John F. Kennedy in the times of Cuban Missile Crisis has helped to improve the world's negative opinion of USA, and also it helped domestically to strengthen the President Kennedy's overall image at home as well as abroad. As a result of this crisis, where the two superpowers came almost in a kind of direct nuclear confrontation, a hotline link was established between the White House and the Kremlin's, where both the leaders can directly engage and try to avoid any kind of crisis that can deepen and that can develop in the future. This hotline is still existing today, and repeatedly there has been transfer and exchange of messages between the Kremlin and White House whenever there is a situation that demands so. Also, as a result of this crisis, both superpowers began to consider scenarios for ending the nuclear arms race and began working toward a permanent nuclear test ban treaty, that is also called as NTBT, which later on rechristened as CTBT, that is Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Not only that, later on, US and Soviet Union, and later on the successor of Soviet Union, Russia, engaged in a kind of treaty or engaged in kind of, we can say, negotiation of negotiation of declining or decreasing the nuclear stockpile, which is known as the START treaty. Now, obviously, in modern situation, modern times, again the crisis and again the relation between US and Russia has soared to a very significant extent, and the START treaty's future seems very bleak in nature. So what we can say in conclusion, that as rightly said by Tony Benn, that all war that develops in our world, it represents a failure of diplomacy. And Cuban Missile Crisis is one best example where the war was averted not by the military action but by a diplomatic actions taken by both the countries. And this is something that we have to keep in mind, that whenever such situations emerge even in our modern times or in the future, the diplomacy becomes a very very important step that can trigger or that can lead to uh, a version of such kind of crisis. So that is all for this particular video. I hope you understood about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the lessons we learned from that, and what has been its legacy and impact on the international relations as well as the global geopolitical order today. So if you like the video, please like, share and subscribe. And you can also comment at what are the topics you want us to make video on. That is all for today. Thank you very much.